So here we are. We are at the second half of the last unit of the course. We've laid a foundation for geology and mining. Now we need to talk about agriculture. Before we talk about different agricultural methods, we have to understand what we're calling the underpinnings of agriculture, which in this case is soil formation. So let's take a look. So we're going to talk a little bit about the history of agriculture, a little bit about soil and fundamentals of soil science, how we get water to crops, the idea of irrigation, the importance of pollinators to crops, why it's important to preserve crop diversity, and some of the issues related to land degradation, soil erosion, the loss of these underpinnings of agriculture, and discuss some solutions, and then ways that we have enacted policy to have conservation be more of a part of agriculture. Okay, so agriculture, if you look at it as a whole, and you don't really stop to think about this, agriculture provides some of our most basic needs, literally from the cotton in our clothes to the foods on our plates. It's also responsible, because it's such a key part of providing for our daily needs, it also has some of the biggest impacts on the environment. So if we're going to do this right, if we're going to do agriculture right, this is where we need to make sure that we're doing sustainable things. So what is agriculture? It's raising crops and livestock for human consumption. You can look at land, agricultural land, in two ways. One is cropland. It's used to raise crops, whether it's for food or fiber. Rangeland or pasture is used for grazing livestock. So we can look at rangeland use and cropland use. Whether we are growing crops or raising animals, it requires a lot of resources: soil, sunlight, water, nutrients, and pollinators. If we are just growing crops, we need these things. If we're raising animals, we need to grow crops, so we need these things to grow the crops to feed the animals, okay, in addition to water that they are going to need to drink. Today, a little bit more than a third of the land on the earth is used to produce food and fiber, okay? So that's quite a chunk of our planet. We can look at agriculture in two ways, okay? Traditional agriculture or subsistence farming, traditional farming, is where you use human power and animal power, a donkey, a mule, a horse, etc., to cultivate, harvest, and distribute crops. Okay, you would produce enough food only for your family, and that's why it's called subsistence farming. You may have extra potatoes that you could trade with your neighbor for extra corn and barter and all that stuff, but you pretty much produced enough just to feed your family. All right. Industrial agriculture is what we do today. You introduce large-scale mechanization and fossil fuel consumption into the idea of agriculture. And that transition happened after the Industrial Revolution, when we moved from living the farming rural lifestyle into the cities. People were working in the cities and didn't have an opportunity to have gardens and farms to produce their own food. So that was the advent. That required the advent of people who farmed for a living rather than people who farmed to live. As we moved into industrialized agriculture, we needed more irrigation, right, to take care of bigger fields. We needed to use synthetic fertilizers to provide nutrients to the crops because we've depleted our soils. We needed to use chemical pesticides to reduce crop pests and to kill weeds, which would increase our yield, in addition to the fact that we added mechanized equipment which burn fossil fuels. So as much as it's great that we've been able to feed a population of 8 billion plus people, it's had a downside, an environmental downside. Industrialized agriculture has also led to something called monoculture, and we talked about this earlier when we were talking about the trees. Farmers are going to grow vast areas with single crops in orderly rows. So when you drive down Pittstown Road in the summertime and you see rows and rows of corn or rows and rows of beans, that's considered monoculture. Mono is one, culture is culture. So you grow one species. Traditional agriculture grows, it's called polyculture. You have mixed crops in the same fields. You may have a row of corn and a row of beans, or a couple rows of corn and a couple rows of beans, but it's all in the same field. It's not vast, acres upon acres of the same thing. The Green Revolution introduced new technologies, right, including crop varieties and farming practices to the developing world, which then increased yields, right? So people got more bang for their buck when it came to crops, and it reduced starvation. But because we've added this new technology, typically fossil fuel powered equipment, and these crop varieties, it has degraded soil, water supplies, and it's even killed a lot of pollinators. If we're going to do agriculture the right way, we need to do it sustainably. So we maintain healthy soil, clean water, we save our pollinators, and we preserve other really vital resources. And again, as you've heard in almost every chapter, if we're going to do things sustainably, we want to do it the way that natural ecosystems function. You don't typically in natural ecosystems have hundreds of acres of the same exact crop or the same exact tree. Okay, it's a polyculture more than a monoculture. So in order to do that, we need to understand the things that are at the base of agriculture, which is soil, water, nutrients, and pollinators. So let's look at soil. Soil is not dirt. Dirt is what you get on your clothes. Soil is a fairly complex system, right? So you've got rock pieces in there, you've got organic matter, you've got water, you've got gases, you've got nutrients, and you've got these microorganisms. Some are decomposers, some are scavengers and detritivores. Soil comes from rock, right? So the basic composition of soil is based on the parent rock. But the microorganisms, right, the biotic component to that soil really helps to shape its nature, okay? Soil is 50% mineral matter, which is that bedrock, 5% organic matter, right, so that's only 55%, and 45% of the average soil is pore space, is holes to allow water to move around and living organisms, okay? In order for plants to grow and to survive and to be fruitful and productive, they need soil with nutrients, right? Soil has to have the right structure for rooting, and it has to be the right composition to hold water, to allow nutrients to be absorbed through the roots, okay? So they need to be in the soil. You need the right texture of soil, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. They need to be able to hold water, but not too much water. And that organic material helps to provide structure and water retention. So you need a really healthy soil in order to allow plants to grow. Some fungi form mutualistic relationships with the plants. We talked about mutualism before. So they provide water and nutrients, so they help uptake that water and those nutrients while the plants do photosynthesis. All right, soil formation starts back in primary succession. Remember, primary succession happens when there is no soil, when there's rock where there never was rock before, land where there never was land before. Water, air, and living organisms are going to break down that parent material, that bare rock, like when a Hawaiian volcano erupts and the rock finally cools. It's by the ocean typically. Those elements are going to start to break it down. The parent material is that base geologic material, okay, in a particular location. So there are some examples: hardened lava, wind-blown dunes, bedrock, right? It's this massive solid rock that makes up most of the Earth's crust. Around here, our bedrock is really shaly, or it's really hard. It's this rock called argillite or blue jingle. It's really, really, really hard. The process that breaks parent material down, the process that the lichens do in the early steps of primary succession, is called weathering, okay? You can do physical weathering. So from wind, blowing over rock enough, you can get physical weathering. You can have rain that starts to evaporate, like break the rock apart. Freezing and thawing is what causes those potholes that we see around here in the spring. The water the water melts after it's been cold in the winter, and then it gets down into the cracks in the road, and then it freezes, and when water becomes ice, it expands. So it expands, right? And then when the ice melts the next day, the crack in the road got bigger. And then the water falls in and it refreezes and it expands even more because it can hold more water. So that's the idea of freezing and thawing. Chemical weathering occurs as water or gases chemically alter rock. So as like the Grand Canyon, right? The Colorado River cut through the Colorado Plateau because it chemically weathered the rock. It just kept going and going and going and broke that rock, not only physically, right, like cutting a cake, but it also dissolved some of those rocks. Biological weathering involves living things. That's why it's called biological weathering, like lichens producing acid. So those lichens, those early pioneer species, are going to produce acid to really start to break down that rock, okay? Or you could have biological weathering when tree roots rub against rocks. Okay, that's not as common as the lichens, but it's still a thing. As you have decomposed organic matter in soil, it's called humus. Humus, H-U-M-U-S, not hummus, not the chickpea tahini stuff that's good on pita chips and carrots, but it's humus. That partially decomposed organic matter is super productive for plant life. So if you have compost, if you have a compost bin or a compost pile, you are creating humus to put on your crops in your garden, right? So weathering is influenced by a number of factors. So climate, right? If you have a warm, moist climate, weathering is going to happen faster. All of those processes tend to happen faster. If you have a lot of plants and decomposers, that adds a lot of organic material to your soil. If you have an area that's full of hills and valleys, okay, that's going to determine exposure to sun, wind, and water. So then that's going to influence soil movement and soil creation. Parent material, right? If whatever the source rock is going to impact the final product, right? So if you look at the black beaches in Hawaii, right? Why are there black beaches in Hawaii? Aren't all beaches like gray or white or beige? No, they're not. Because the parent material that the rocks that the waves have worked on to create that sand is actually basalt. It's black. There are green beaches and pink beaches that I've seen. And then time, right? So how fast weathering and accumulation of organic matter takes place is also a function of time. This is super important. Soil is renewable, but at a very, very slow rate. It takes about 500 years for an inch of topsoil to form, somewhere in there. I'm going to have to check my notes when we do the key points. But it's super slow. It's renewable, but we're definitely not being as careful with it as we should be. So if you look at soil, right, and you cut down in a cross section in the earth, soil and the movement of particles in that soil create distinct horizons. When you cut down into the earth, you get something called a soil profile, all right? So the degree of weathering and concentration of organic matter decreases as you get further down in the soil profile. This should make a lot of sense because the surface, right, the surface is where you get your weathering and your organic materials. As you get further down into the soil, there are really fewer living things down at the bottom, so you're going to have less organic matter and less exposure to the weathering elements. Minerals that are dissolved or suspended in water that's percolating down can be transported downward in a process called leaching. So minerals can be leached from one layer and put into another. Okay, so you are going to need to know this diagram. I did not come up with the layers in this order, because if I had, they'd be in alphabetical order. They're not in alphabetical order. So you need to know your horizons and roughly what they are. O, A, E, B, C, R. All right. The O, or horizon, is the surface, right? And it's a thin layer, as you can see. It's where all of your undecomposed organic matter sits, your litter layer. All right. Beneath the O layer is the topsoil layer, or the A horizon. All right. This is inorganic minerals mixed with those humus components, with that organic material. This is the most nutritive part of soil for plants. This is where the nutrients are. This is where you need good, solid, thick topsoil layer to allow agriculture to happen. Okay. The E horizon tends to be heavily leached with most minerals. So the minerals go from this horizon, the alluviated or leaching layer, to the subsoil, to horizon B, right? As you get down, weathering decreases, right? So this is the weathered parent material. That's the C horizon. And this is the bedrock, lava, anything like that. It's the R horizon. Characteristics of soil vary widely from one place to the next. Typically, a soil's color indicates its fertility. If it's a darker soil, it's going to be richer in organic matter or humus, so it's going to be better for agriculture. If the soil is pale, right, it's not going to be great for agriculture because it's low in organic matter. Soil texture is determined by the size of its particles. And when we look at soil, we look at three main sizes of particles. The largest particles that we see in soil are sand. Sand is 0.05 to 2 millimeters in size. Okay? So the biggest you see is about 2 millimeters in size. The next smallest size is silt, 0.002 to 0.05 of a millimeter in diameter, really small. And then anything that's less than 0.002 of a millimeter in diameter is called clay. So sand, silt, and clay, from biggest to smallest, right? If you have soil with an even mixture of these particles, we call it loam. Loam is the preferred soil for agriculture because it is the perfect balance of these particles to allow water to move through without sitting there and basically suffocating the roots of these plants that you're trying to grow. But it also allows for water to stay there, to allow it to be absorbed by the plants. I'm going to teach you guys how to read. This is called the soil triangle. So we're going to do a worksheet on it, and we're going to take a quiz on it. So if you have a high level of clay in your soil, there aren't many pore spaces that exist to allow water to pass through. And the minerals in clay soils are really sticky. They tend to stick together so water doesn't pass through and air doesn't pass through. So if you have, especially around here, if you have wet areas in your yard that stay wet for like a really long time, chances are there's a lot of clay in your soil. Sandy soils, on the other hand, do not allow water to stay in the ground, right? If you go to the beach, okay, when you were a little kid or even now, I don't care, and you dump a bucket of water, you're trying to make a moat around your sandcastle, right? And you you go down and you get a bucket of water from the ocean and you dump it into your moat that you've spent a lot of time digging, and it just soaks right in, right? Sandy soils allow water to pass through too quickly, so the water doesn't stay. So you have to irrigate much more frequently. And like I said, loam is the preferred soil because it allows the right blend of water to pass through and air to get in and water retention. Soil structure also measures the clumpiness of the soil. Okay, if it's really clumpy, it's considered compacted and it doesn't absorb water as well. And you want a moderate pH soil, not too acidic, not too basic or alkaline. Okay, if it is too acidic or too basic, you may inhibit uptake of necessary nutrients. So if you look at soil in a couple of places, this is tropical rainforest soil. It's light in color and it's all the same color. You don't see a whole lot of layers. They are much less agriculturally productive here in the Amazon rainforest than they are in a place like Kansas. Okay, so all this precipitation leaches nutrients out of the top layers. So your nutrients are way down at the bottom. Right, so that's why they do this slash and burn agriculture, to increase the nutrient content of those soils. You can see the beautiful horizons here in the plains in Kansas and Iowa. So a lot of these tropical farmers are going to do what they call swidden agriculture. So they hang out, they slash and burn, right? This idea of slash and burn agriculture. They're going to do slash and burn, and then eventually productivity is going to drop. So that way they don't get as much crop yield anymore. So then they hang out there for a few years on the plot, and then they move somewhere else and do more slash and burn. Sometimes if there's enough time allowed between the swidden agriculture, the forest and the soil can recover, but normally they don't typically give enough time. So if we're going to grow these crops, we need to irrigate, okay? So irrigation is when you take more water than what is naturally received by precipitation, okay? You need to irrigate when you're growing crops that are water intensive, like rice. Rice is grown in a paddy, which is flooded for most of the time. Or in areas with dry climates, like here. This is the Southern California desert. And if you're going to grow stuff here, you need to irrigate. Okay, this is center pivot irrigation. It's a kind of spray irrigation. So you can tell how far the sprayer reaches. It doesn't reach any further than here. Irrigation is the largest use of water, and we talked about that in chapter 15, with 70% of all fresh water that we use goes to agriculture. So let's look at some of these irrigation methods. So furrow irrigation, that's what you see in the picture, literally cuts furrows between the crops and you fill them with water, right? You just flood the field with water. It's cheap. It doesn't cost a lot to dig these furrows, but the downside is a lot of that water gets lost to evaporation or runoff. So it's a waste of water. It doesn't get where it needs to be. So we're going to do pros and cons for each of these irrigation methods. Flood irrigation is where you flood an entire field with water, okay? Again, a pro is that it's really cheap. A con, you lose about 20% of the water to evaporation, and you get something called waterlogged soil. We're going to talk about the impacts of waterlogged soil in a little bit. Spray irrigation is what you saw in the first picture, the center pivot irrigation. You have equipment, right? You pump groundwater out into spray nozzles and you spread it across an agricultural field. It is more efficient than the flood and furrow irrigation because less than a quarter of that water is lost to evaporation or runoff. It's probably closer to 10%. The downsides, the system is expensive to install, right? And you're limited to where you can grow your crop. You can only grow your crop where your irrigation system can reach, okay? And it also requires more energy to run because you wind up having to move these sprayers. You have to pump water up from the ground. So it becomes pretty expensive. But this is really frequently what you see in farms around here. The most effective method to do for irrigation is drip irrigation. You put this system of really little hoses all around your farm, and then they're perforated. So they release small amounts of water directly to the plant roots, okay? It's really efficient. There's only about 5% of that water is lost to evaporation or runoff. So the water gets to where it needs to be. But the big con, as has been the case with all of these things that we've talked about for this whole year, is that it's expensive, right? So we tend to do things that are cheap rather than the things that make the most environmental sense. So let's talk about waterlogging. When you wind up overwatering crops, okay, the soil gets oversaturated to the point where the plant roots drown. Plant roots need air, okay? So if you overwater or waterlog, the plant roots will not survive, okay? Another problem related to irrigation is salinization. So it's the buildup of salts in the surface soil layers. When you overwater, the water evaporates the dissolved minerals in that water, especially around here if you have hard water, those minerals are left behind. And it can create soil that is too saline or too salty for crops to grow, okay? So you can flush the land with less saline water or change your crop to something like barley that's more salt tolerant. So one way to do it, one way to be effective and more effective and irrigate more sustainably is to match your crops to your climate, right? So don't grow water-intensive crops in the desert. Again, the government has subsidized lots of things, including the water industry, in arid areas to make water artificially inexpensive when it really should be pretty expensive. So switching to drip irrigation is going to reduce water use as well. So we talked about water for plants. Let's talk about nutrients for plants. Fertilizers contain these essential nutrients that plants need to grow, typically nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. All right. So you can use inorganic fertilizers that are mined or synthetically manufactured. We talked about the Haber-Bosch process. We talked about the nitrogen cycle. We didn't talk about it in depth, but that's one of the ways that we create inorganic fertilizers. If you look at organic fertilizers, okay, it's made from the remains or waste of organisms. So crops, crop residue, manure, charcoal, vegetation, and compost. Okay, and I alluded to compost before, which is a form of humus. Compost is when decomposers break down organic matter in a controlled environment. So if you have a compost pile or a compost barrel, you've got worms and eggshells and all kinds of things in there. It sits for a while, decomposition starts to take place, and you wind up with this beautiful natural fertilizer for your garden. If we use fertilizers, they're going to increase crop yields, but you can overutilize them, okay? So the Green Revolution, the methods that came from the Green Revolution have really increased reliance on inorganic fertilizers. We see the consequence of that as being the nutrients don't stay in the soil as much, so you wind up with other environmental problems like eutrophication. And here it is. So if you have runoff from these inorganic fertilizers, it's going to make its way into surface water and cause these phytoplankton blooms, which we talked about when we talked about Chesapeake Bay. So I told you guys then that eutrophication is one of these big ideas. Guess what? It still is a big idea. Some of those nitrogen fertilizers can volatilize into the air. They can turn into gas, which contributes to photochemical smog and acid deposition. And the NOxes coming out of the tailpipes of the fossil fuel running farm equipment can also produce nitrogen oxides. Drip irrigation is one of the best ways to be more targeted with your watering. The idea of precision agriculture is still is one of the biggest ideas in making agriculture sustainable. So instead of applying fertilizer on day 27 after you've planted your crops, stop. Take a look at the soil, monitor soil nutrient levels, apply fertilizer when it's needed, not just because it's the way, that it's always been done. And using organic fertilizer as opposed to inorganic fertilizer is going to increase water retention in the soil. So then you wind up using less water for irrigation. But you can over apply organic fertilizer just like you can over apply inorganic fertilizer. So you can still get eutrophication that way. It's not a perfect solution, but it's much better. So the importance of pollination. Pollination is when male pollen fertilizes female eggs, okay? Grasses and conifer trees are pollinated by wind. Pollen is that thing that makes us all sneeze. Many of us sneeze in the fall and in the spring. Typically, plants with really bright flowers are going to attract animals to do their pollination, okay? Those animals are called pollinators. Bees are some of the most well-known pollinators, but not the only pollinators. So as they move from flower to flower, they take the pollen from one flower, and when they come in contact with the next flower, they drop the pollen off. So that's fertilization. A lot of our crops are pollinated by wind, like the grain crops, but a lot of our fruit, vegetable, and nut crops depend on insects for pollination, right? So the native bees, the bumblebees, the European honeybees, some flies are going to be responsible for that. Farmers and orchard keepers have hives of domesticated honeybees that are brought in to pollinate their plants, or they, depending on the temperatures, they stay on site. Grower Row that I go to regularly, they have a couple hives of bees that they keep there to increase pollination for their donated produce. So we increased our plowing in the mid-20th century, and we wound up applying lots of pesticides that killed a lot of soil-dwelling bees. These native honeybees, native bees that are really critical in the pollination of alfalfa fields. And seed production dropped. So there's a definite connection between the presence of pollinators in a field or near a field and the yield of that field. Okay. A lot of those insects are dwindling because pesticides are killing them, and they really don't have habitat. Our wild populations of pollinators are dying in North America because of something called pesticide drift. So we wind up with pesticides drifting, from a field where they're supposed to kill, larvae, and they wind up killing native pollinators anyway. So it's kind of like bycatch, but for pesticides. Parasites and pathogens get introduced as a result of travel and trade, and we're getting rid of habitat and flowers because we are applying herbicides on farms and lawns. There's a disease called colony collapse disorder that is really wreaking havoc on the bee population. They think it's a perfect storm of all of those factors that we talked about. There are specific pesticides. I got marigolds one year from Home Depot, and they had these in it that are causing risks to native pollinators as well. So one way that we can increase the biodiversity and reduce the idea of monoculture in our agriculture, keeping monoculture out of our agriculture will increase the yield and likelihood of the crop survival, because if you raise a monoculture, you wind up having one catastrophe wipe out the entire crop. So this is a stunning statistic. 90% of the food consumed that we eat comes from 15 crop species and 8 livestock species. That's kind of scary. It's not quite single monoculture, but it's pretty close. So if we increase our crop diversity, we are going to ensure that our crops are more resistant to diseases or pests. So they're looking at introducing some of these ancient varieties into our modern crops, potatoes and corn. There are places called seed banks that are there to preserve this kind of genetic diversity. There is a doomsday seed vault in the Arctic in Norway that contains millions of seeds from all over the world to preserve that genetic diversity. So how can we conserve land and soil resources? We're facing challenges with each of those things that we need for agriculture: soil, water, nutrients, and pollinators. We can't degrade these resources and move to new areas, because then that's where we get desertification, deforestation, loss of biodiversity, the rise of invasive species, additional pollution, and soil erosion. So we have to do something to conserve these resources. It's the only sustainable solution. So land degradation is when land is deteriorated to the point that productivity and biodiversity are diminished and the ecosystems don't function. So what are some indications of that? Increased soil erosion, nutrient depletion, water scarcity, and pollution are all results of that. Soil degradation is when the soil itself becomes less productive. If you remove forests, productivity is going to go down. If you use too much cropland for agriculture, it's going to the soil is going to degrade. And if you overgraze your livestock, the soil is going to degrade. It has, as soil degrades, as you can see in this picture here, food production drops. It doesn't have the right composition to produce enough food. So if soil degradation is on the rise and the human population is also on the rise, that's going to signal a future problem that's pretty severe. Erosion is what happens when material is removed from one place and put somewhere else, either through the movement of wind or water. When it's dropped off somewhere new, we call that deposition. They're natural processes, but they're accelerated as the result of agriculture, okay, because we're not doing our best to preserve that soil, okay? Areas that are windy or sloped or that have a whole lot of precipitation or not much ground cover are at the greatest risk for erosion. So we do three things to make areas more vulnerable to erosion. So we over-cultivate the fields, okay, or we over-till them, we overwork the field, which means that the particles don't clump, it's over-processed, and it doesn't stay in place. We overgraze rangeland, which then reduces the vegetation holding the soil in place so it erodes, and we wind up clearing forests on steep slopes, which is basically setting up for the first rainstorm to erode a good chunk of the land. A huge portion of our croplands are suffering from erosion and soil degradation. We have human activities have increased the rates of erosion, even when when you take all the other methods, the reasons for erosion combined. A lot of the world's population lives in arid or semi-arid environments called drylands. They are really prone to desertification, where more than 10% of the productivity of an area is lost, and wind and water erosion are the biggest causes. So in the United States, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we, as a nation, went out into the West and started farming, industrialized agriculture. They took the native grasslands that were out there that had really deep taproots. I've seen pictures of it. I'll share it with you guys. Really deep roots and a really solid soil structure. They plowed it under and planted wheat, because wheat was the commodity post-World War II, all right? Post-World War I, sorry. There was a really severe drought in the 1930s that worsened the impacts of that soil loss and that change in soil structure. that wound up creating really strong winds that wound up eroding millions of tons of topsoil. And it created something called the Dust Bowl. They lost 4 inches of topsoil, okay, in this orangey red area in just a few years, a matter of 5 years, okay? And that caused some major changes to our policy. In response, in 1935, we passed the Soil Conservation Act, which set up agencies that work with local farmers to help them deal with erosion. The Natural Resource Conservation Service has soil extensions, and there's one on Pittstown Road headed for Route 12 on the left as you're headed towards Route 12 to help farmers and developers deal with and prevent soil erosion. So we can come up with, we've come up since the Dust Bowl with ways to conserve soil. You know, soil is a renewable resource, but very slowly. So one thing you can do is crop rotation. So instead of planting the same crops in the same field year after year, you can rotate in legumes, right, or beans that have these nitrogen-fixing bacteria on their roots to boost soil nitrogen, to boost the levels of nitrogen in the soil. And then if you plant different crops, you're not only improving soil health, but you're also reducing the risk of pest and disease cycles as compared to when you continuously plant. You plant corn in the field every year. Any larvae of that pest or virus, disease causing organism, they don't have that safety net, that resource, right? So when you rotate your crops, it's just better overall. Water is a really powerful erosive force. So typically when it runs downhill. So instead of plowing your rows up and downhill, if you're plowing a hill, you do something called contour plowing. You plow sideways across the hillside, right? Versus furrows that run right down the hillside. In places like China, these are rice fields in China, you can build terraces, right? It's like steps on the sides of a mountain, right? I think that looks so cool. You can do something called intercropping. So you can plant different rows of crops in the soil. You can also use cover crops, which will then reduce erosion from the wind when you're not in an active farming season. And if it's beans that you put in, you can restore nitrogen to the soil. You can also use these things called shelter belts. They're real common around here. Those are the tree lines between the fields that serve as windbreaks. And depending on what you plant in here, they can be fruit trees if you're in the right area, or around here they tend to be habitat for native species. Something else you can do is conservation tillage. So you reduce the amount of plowing. You don't plow as deeply, you don't plow as often. So you don't leave bare soil surfaces, which are then exposed to erosion. And another thing that you can really do is this idea of no-till farming. So you harvest your crop, and instead of tilling it instead of putting it underneath the ground again, you just plant right over top of it, right? And that's what no-till farming looks like. And we talked about cover crops. You can plant them when the main crop isn't growing to help preserve the soil. When we talk about grazing affects the soil as well. We got 3.4 billion grazing animals, goats, cattle, and sheep, okay? If the livestock populations do not exceed the carrying capacity, right, rangelands can still be functional ecosystems. If you don't allow the plants to regrow, right, if you don't allow that, what they call regeneration of plant biomass, what you get is overgrazing, okay? Overgrazing creates this positive feedback loop, okay? So if you overgraze, the soil is going to erode. And if the soil erodes, it's not going to allow native plants to grow, which is going to make desertification even more of a thing, right? So that's a problem. A lot of nations spend a lot of money in subsidies to really encourage and promote unsustainable practices, okay? Like almonds in the Central Valley in California. In the U.S., about a fifth of an average farmer's income comes from subsidies, government money, okay? Subsidies are good because they ensure that our farmers are getting income, but they also allow land to be cultivated that probably shouldn't be, okay? And it increases food production, which then decreases prices for other farmers. So it's in the long run, it's not a good thing. So every 5 or 6 years, Congress passes legislation called the Farm Bill that really starts to guide agricultural policy. The Conservation Reserve Program pays farmers to look at to turn cropland that won't work as cropland anymore into something called conservation reserves. And we use policy to select farmers who are going to be awarded that contract, depending on what the farmer's trying to do. And we even have international agencies that promote conservation through something called the Food and Agriculture Organization. They're trying to achieve a lot of the same goals. All right, we have gone through the underpinnings of agriculture, and we are ready to foray into the last chapter of the course.